In this video, I'll show how I use Capture One Pro and Affinity Photo to create this colourful and vibrant puppy image from this flat and boring RAW file. If you find this video useful, then give it a thumbs up and maybe even subscribe. Here we have the original RAW file of a little puppy that literally bumped into me while on a walk, and I've cropped this. Let's take a look. Here it is. I've chosen a 16:9 ratio. I thought a wide image would be perfect for this one, as I could include the dog's tail and have some space on the left for the dog to look into. I think it's always a good idea to have a little think about your composition before you go off on your edit. To set up your cropping ratio, all you have to do is right click and from the ratio drop down select the ratio you require. And to set the actual crop, you just tug around on the corners and move the box about. Simple. I won't bother going through recropping the image. You can see how I've cropped it, and it can take a while to get it absolutely perfect. Okay, let's get back to editing. The first thing I'm going to do is to set the base exposure. Open the exposure panel. I'm pretty happy with the exposure. Maybe it could do with just a tad more brightness. So I'll hover over the brightness and use my mouse wheel just to up it a few notches. And that will just bring up the midtones a tad. Next, saturation. I'd like this image to be really bright and colourful, so I'll up it quite a bit. I'll raise the saturation to around 30-ish, and that's looking good. I think that's a really nice starting point. Next, we'll look at the high dynamic range. I want to recover as much of the highlight detail as possible, especially here. I'll just up it to 100%, and then shadow I'll bring up maybe to around 30-ish. And that gives us a little latitude in the shadow detail for when I add contrast with the colour balance tool in a little while. Okay, not bad so far. Next we'll go to the levels tool and set the black and white points. So just bring the blacks up to the first bit of data in the histogram. So that's our black point set. And then set our white point. I like the whites to be very white, so I think about here. And that's lightened up all the whites without blowing out the highlights. Next we'll go down to our colour balance panel to add the finishing touches to the overall tone. I'm not going to touch the master. I'll start with the shadows, and what I want to do here is to darken the shadows a bit to add a little contrast, a little more definition. And just bring it down until it looks about right. I think that's fine. Deepening the shadows has also increased the saturation. And I'd like to just add a little green into the shadows. So I'll just slide this over into the green area. And that's getting there. The greens are starting to look nice and rich. That's looking good. We've got nice rich deep greens in the backdrop foliage. These deep greens should contrast really nicely against the browny orange colour of the dog. Let's take a look at the midtones. I don't think I need to change the colour of the midtones at all, but I think I'll take a quick look at the midtone brightness. I'll just have a little play, and it looks like it could do with just a tad lightening, so I'll lighten up the midtones a little bit. That looks pretty nice. That's made the image generally brighter and more alive. And last but not least, the highlights. Now I'm not going to change the brightness of the highlights. The bright colours are fine. These little highlights are really nice. I'm just going to add a little yellow into the highlights. I'll just play with the colour and saturation of this yellow for a second to get it right about there. That's fine. And that's added a nice summery yellow tinge to the lighter areas of the foliage to complement the green. It really mostly shows up in the grass and the foliage, and slightly in the whites. Next we're going to use the colour editor. We'll use the colour editor to enhance the colour of the dog. and the foliage. Okay, let's open it up. And now we're going to target and change specific colours. Select the colour picker. We're in the Advanced tab. And we just go over and select a colour. We'll grab an orangey brown from the dog. Maximise the saturation range. Click View Selected Colour Range so that we can see the colours that we're going to affect. We have mostly the dog selected. Now using these handles we'll just alter the range so that we make sure we've got as much of the dog and as little of the background there. I want to grab as little of the background as possible while still having as much of the dog as possible. Now let's try here with the red side. Again, all I'm trying to do is get as much of the dog fur selected as possible. That's okay. We're going to have a little bit of foliage selected here and there. Let's just try squeezing this in a tad. No, I'm starting to lose the deep browns of the dog. I think that's the best I'm going to get, and that's a pretty good selection. Okay, let's have a play with the hue. I don't want to make it drastically different. I want to keep the same basic shade, but maybe a little more on the red side. Now I'm going to just up the saturation on the dog's fur so he stands out a lot more against the backdrop of green. 22 seems about right. I'm liking that. We'll turn the other colours back on just to have a look. That's better. We're really getting a nice contrast between the colour of the dog and the colour of all the foliage. Next I want to tone down the bushes and the grass and trees. Make sure my colour picker is selected. It is. And then go and pick something green and maximise the saturation range. View our selected colour and then use the handles to make sure that I've got all the grass, trees and bushes selected. First on the green side like so, and then on the yellow side. I don't want to go too far into the yellows because I want to leave some yellow in the grass and bushes. And then I'm going to increase the smoothness so that the transition between the greens and the yellows in the foliage is less abrupt. Then I'm going to push the greens over into the blue side so they become more bluey green. Okay, about there. That's looking nice. And now we're starting to get a really nice tonal contrast between the dog and the backdrop. I'm liking that. Now we'll reduce the saturation of the greens. Reducing the saturation of the greens makes them look more natural, and it'll also make the dogs stand out a lot more against the background. Okay, that's starting to look pretty good. Let's bring the brightness down just a bit. And I think about there. Yep, 9. -9 seems fine. And that is really starting to look quite nice. That's stage 1 of the edit completed. All our basic adjustments are sorted. Next we have sharpening. Select the details tab. And let's double click to zoom in on the head, as that's where most people will be looking, so we make sure that's right. First I bring up the amount so that I can see the effect of the radius more. Then I set the radius. And then another tweak on the amount to finalise the sharpening. Not too much, about there's fine. And because of the type of image this is, I don't want this to be over sharpened. I don't want the dog's fur to be razor sharp. It just won't suit it. Now, the next thing I'd like to do is just to add some highlights into the fur of the dog, to give the fur more of a mottled look, as that is how I saw the fur when I met the dog. The fur was absolutely beautiful, but the streak effect is not really showing up on the image. And the way I'm going to do this is with a layer. Go to the layer panel and then hold down on the plus to bring up this little mini panel and new filled layer. Then from the exposure panel, just up the brightness. I'm going to bring it up enough so that I will be able to see the effect of the streaks. Next, I just want to put it onto the dog's fur, so I'm going to go up to the layer and clear the mask, right click, clear mask, then click M on my keyboard to display my mask, and B to bring up my brush, right click and set my size. And now I'm going to just paint into the areas on the fur where I want the highlights to happen. Basically everywhere apart from the outsides. I don't want to highlight even more where it's already bright or lit up by the sun. Okay, nearly there. I've got all the areas that are not lit up, or the areas where I want the streaks to appear. Then press M to get rid of the mask. And now the problem is the fur is all just too bright, no streaks. We can fix this using a Luminar range. I'll just move the right one across so we've got all the highlights, and then bring the left side across to the right, omitting more and more of the darker colours, and then set the fall off so the transition between the light and the dark is smoother. And there we go, we're getting the nice streaky highlights in the dog's fur. That's looking great, but I just want to move this out the way, and then just a final few adjustments, moving it around until I think I've got it right. And there we go, that's fine. I'm going to have a play with the layer opacity. First bring it all the way down, and then bring it back up and set it to the point where the streaks are noticeable but not too prominent. Let's take a quick look. There's before and after. In fact, we should increase it just a tad. And there we go, we've given our dog lovely streaks in the fur. And now this little puppy's looking a lot more like how I remembered him. Next, I want to add a little bit of clarity to the eyes and the nose and the collar to make them stand out a little bit against all the fur. I'll just add another layer. I'll add an empty layer this time. Press M to display the mask. Then right click to give myself a very nice small brush, just bring down the size. Mouse wheel to zoom in. I really need a tiny brush for this one. And then just paint into the eyeball area. I know this is a really small area, it'll be subtle, but subtle differences do make an impact. Okay, that's good enough for the eye area. So let's move on down to the nose. Set my brush size and make sure I paint over the whole of the nose like so. I think I'm going to have to just get my eraser out and trim up the edges, so press E and then go around the edges, just cleaning up a little bit like so. I probably don't need to be this careful, it's quite a small area, but there you go. And now I'm going to go over to the collar and paint into the whole of the collar area. I think it looks really nice when little details like this stand out against the subject, just like shiny little bits of jewellery like a ring or earrings standing out against a person. Okay, just with my eraser, just tidy up the edges. Again, I don't need to be too careful, I just need to go around and make sure it doesn't bleed too much into the fur. I think that will be fine for this. Press M to turn the mask off. Okay, just zoom in a little so that I can see the effect better. Then down into the clarity panel and bring the clarity up to a point where it's not too overdone, but you can see the effect. Now we've made the eye, the nose and the collar stand out a little against the dog. Small details, but they do make a difference. Now for the last little job in Capture One, I just want to make the tongue a little more vivid. Okay, add another layer. Press M for mask and B for brush as I'm on my eraser, and then paint into the tongue like so, and then turn the mask off with M. Now into the colour editor, select the colour picker and pick a nice pink on the tongue, and select the range. Make sure we have all of the reds and pinks selected, And now with the hue, I'm going to make the pink on the tongue a little more red. And then bring down the lightness and up the saturation. Let's take a look. Okay, that's far too much. Let's reduce the saturation a tad, like so. Play with the lightness. A little touch less saturation. Okay, let's look at before and after. Before and after. Now, I like the effect, but I think it's just a little too strong, so I'll bring down the opacity of the layer. Okay, let's take a look. Off, on. I like that. The tongue now is a little bit more defined. Now that's the first Capture One section of this edit complete. Next we're going to use Affinity Photo. I want to use Affinity Photo for a really heavy edit of the background. I'm going to completely remove this lamppost. It's horrible. I'm going to get rid of all of these distracting white gaps. And I'm going to use a depth of field blur to give us even more bokeh, to blur out the background even more, to separate the dog even more from the backdrop. Okay, let's do it. So select my pointer and then right click, select Edit With and choose Affinity Photo. I'm going to use TIFF and 16-bit, so I have maximum colour information. Everything else is going to be the same. Scale up 100%, I don't want to resize. Click Open, and it generates the TIFF, then opens Affinity Photo. This is real time, I've not speeded it up, it will be really quick, and we're done, we're ready to edit. Okay, so the first job we're going to do in Affinity Photo is to remove the lead. That's the most obvious distraction. Press Ctrl and J to duplicate the background. I like to have a backup. And then I'm going to use the patch tool to get rid of the majority of the lead. If I use the inpainting tool, it might use out of focus areas which will look wrong. I need the patch to be in the same focal plane. So go to the inpainting brush tool here and grab the patch tool. Then let's circle the section we want to patch. Then move to the source area. Now to the next section, circle another patch. Set the source, always on the same plane, or trying to be. Now this little section. And now just going up the lead, bit by bit, patch by patch. Only a couple of sections left. I think I'll try from the right this time. I'm only grabbing the source from the left or the right of the area, as I want to keep the same depth of field for the patches. I'll do one final little piece with the patch tool, so circle it and then make sure I get the path and the grass just the same, like so. Okay, that's the majority done. Now for this last piece here, I'll use the inpainting tool. It's a fantastic tool, really useful. I'll try this little piece here first. Not a bad start. And now the last section. And like magic, the lead is gone. Excellent. And one final little blob there. Okay, so it's not perfect, but I don't think anyone's going to notice the transition once we've finished. Once I've cut the dog out and applied the perspective blur, it will be fine, I think. Next, I'm going to get rid of this horrible lamppost because it is absolutely disgusting. Right square bracket to increase my brush size. Let's see if the inpainting tool can take this lamppost out in one go. It really is a monstrosity. And fingers crossed. Here we go. It won't take too long. Bingo! And that has done a really good job. Excellent. Apart from just here and just here, there's a bit of replication. To fix this, we just do a little bit of inpainting here. And that's made it worse. So what I'm going to do instead is use the patch tool. Okay, so let's just select the patch tool. If I select this little area here and then just move slightly to set the source, not bad. Just once more, get rid of this little semicircle. Okay, let's take a look. So we have something significantly different. That'll do for our needs. Here I've sped up the video because I think it would be quite boring just to watch me filling in holes one after the other in real time. Here we go, just the last couple and we're done. That's looking pretty good, that'll do. Next I want to get rid of all of these big holes so my backdrop is green. And I think I will in-paint them. And again, this section is quite long, so I've sped it up. I'm using a combination of in-painting and patching. If you want to see how I remove a particular part, then just slow down the video. There's a playback speed selector in the settings section of the YouTube video player. Okay, I'm not going to touch this or these other spots yet. What I'm going to do is to create a mask of the dog so that I can blur the rest of the background, and then I will tidy the background up a little bit more. Okay, let's mask the dog. First I'll Ctrl J to copy the background, grab my selection brush tool, then I'll select around the edge of the dog, roughly. Rough. Sorry about that, it just slipped out. I'm going to trace around the area of the dog, just to the point where the dog intersects the grass. I won't be blurring that part, so there's no point in masking that. Now just fill in the holes, all the way down the body, like so. Nearly there. And done. I want to erase the selection away from this grass a little bit. And that's it, I've masked the dog all the way down to this grass here. Now we'll go to Select and Refine Edges. Wait for the refine process to set up and perform its calculations. And we're there. I'll move the panel out of the way. We've got our refine brush. I'll just make it a tad bigger. Now we just draw around the edges like so, bit by bit, and it cleans up the mask at the edge of the dog. It refines the selection, and that's looking pretty good. And the reason that I'm doing this in sections is that if one section doesn't refine very well, then I can just Ctrl Z that section, redo it, and hopefully have a better refine. Now we're just reaching the end of the dog's back, so the last section there, and just let it perform its billions of calculations. Next I'll paint around the muzzle, making sure I include all of the stray hairs. The head and face of the dog are really important, as that's where most people look. Okay, that's a really nice selection. Just a couple left. Now the ruff at the front of the dog. Ruff! I've got to stop saying ruff. We're nearly there. One last part from the chest down to the feet. And more waiting. Doesn't take too long really. And I think that is a really good selection. Easily good enough for our purposes. Apply, and then I'm just going to save the mask into a spare channel. Go to Select and Save Selection and as Spare Channel. And now I have a backup of my selection in a spare channel here, just in case I need it later. Okay, let's get rid of these marching ants, turn off the selection here. And now we're going to remove most of this dog from this top layer. We'll remove from the head here down to just above the intersection with the grass there. With the inpainting tool, and it should fill in with a lot of the green, which is what we're after. Grab the inpainting tool, this is the fun part, and paint over the dog. The reason I don't do this with the selection active, actually inside the selection, is because it can leave unsightly edges. You can smooth it, but this is just much quicker and easier. There we go, one massive in-painting selection. This doesn't have to be perfect, it's for the transition of the edges of the dog to the background. We will be putting the dog that we selected earlier back onto this background. And that's done a really good job. That's an excellent job, in fact. Now if we just turn this layer off and then select the layer below, you can see we've got the dog on this layer. All we have to do is load our selection from the spare channel that we saved it to earlier. Just right click and load to selection. Control C and Control V to copy the dog to a new layer. Move the layer to the top. Turn the top background layer back on and turn the other layers off. Deselect to turn off the marching ants. And now we have a dog which is separate from the background, like so. Now we do seem to have a little glitch here which can really easily be fixed. All we have to do is to just turn off these two layers, turn on this layer with the dog and the grass, then we'll just grab this inner part here using the selection tool. So we'll use the freehand selection tool. Now I'll select all of the inside part of the dog here where the dog intersects with the grass. Now before I actually make the selection, I must select the third layer down, which is the layer with the dog and the grass. And now I have my selection and the layer selected. Just Control C, select the top layer and Control V. Now if I turn on these layers like so, turn off this one, it's hidden now, and finally deselect. As you can see, that little area is now filled back in. Now if I select the layers with the patch and the dog, I can turn him off and on. And he's really nicely blended with the background. I just want to merge these two layers into one, so select both of them. And merge selected, which is actually in the layer menu. Layer and merge selected. So now we have the one layer of the dog. Okay, so the next thing to do is clean up our background. So first of all, turn off the dog. Now again, I'm going to use a combination of the patch tool and the inpainting tool to just wherever I need to clean the background. I'm going to speed this up like so. Again, if you want to view individual parts, just slow it down in your YouTube player. And we're done. Let's have a quick look at our dog on the background. That's looking pretty good, not bad at all, so let's just turn him off again. And the next thing we're going to do is apply a blur to the distant background. And to do this, we will need to use a filter. So the filter we will choose, let's go to Filters, and select the depth of field blur. We want tilt shift. Set our center. I think the center needs to be around here. That's where the blur will start. Stretch this up and move it and set the radius. Now we set the radius, we can actually see properly where the blur is happening. So we'll just get everything in position. I don't use this one very often, so I'm a little rusty. Straighten it out, like so. Turn on Preserve Alpha to affect the edges. Now I don't want any depth of field blur at the bottom, so I'll just move this down. I don't want the foreground grass to have the effect. Final little tweak, there we go. Now we've got no depth of field at the bottom. By the grass, we've got it just in the distant foliage. And that's doing a really nice job. I think that's a really nice depth of field effect. Okay, so let's get rid of that. Let's try turning the dog on. And because of the depth of field blur, he is now in super glorious 3D. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that so far, so I think I'll just flatten all of these layers before I head back to Capture One Pro. From Document, just select Flatten. And in a second it will merge all of our various layers into one. I just want to get rid of a few little bits that are standing out to me, so I'll use the inpainting brush and zap them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, gone. Okay, I think that'll do for the Affinity Photos section. Let's just quit. Do you want to save your changes? Yes, of course I do. Save with layers. There are no layers, but I'll choose yes. Okay, here we are back in Capture One, and I'd like to add a vignette. Now normally you would use the vignette tool, but I'm not going to do that. I find I have much more control if I use a radial gradient on a layer. So I'll just press T to bring up the radial gradient tool. So I just place my vignette by the head, like so, and then stretch to the edge. And from the exposure tab, bring down the brightness. And once the brightness is set to the correct level, we have a really nice vignette. Okay, I think we're near enough done with this edit. We're really close. As a final step, I think I'd like to make the scene a little dreamy, just a little softer. Maybe just add a little glow in the highlights. This will involve one last trip back to Affinity Photo. Right click on the thumbnail and then choose Open With rather than Edit With, as I want to edit this file rather than create a new variant. Okay, first things first, Ctrl J to duplicate the layer, then Filters and Blur and Gaussian Blur. I'd like a nice big soft glow, so I'll make the radius really large. Apply, and it only takes a second. Down with the opacity, select this little cog to access the layer blend ranges. Then bring this little point down to reduce the opacity of the blacks. This will have the effect of reducing the blur on the shadows. Okay, done. Now I'm just going to erase the effect a little from the dog itself. So select our paintbrush, black colour, set our opacity quite low, and paint a little of the glow effect away from the dog's fur. This is a really subtle effect, and you may not think that erasing it from the dog's fur or erasing most of it from the dog's fur will make a difference, but it will. One last check on the opacity of the glow. Okay, I think that's fine. Okay, we're finally done, so let's flatten the document. And then we'll exit back to Capture One. Yes, I want to save. And after a couple of seconds, we're back in Capture One. And for the purposes of this tutorial, we're done. All we have left to do now is to view before and after. So here we go. Here's the file before, and here's after. Before and after.